Hello, I am Bradley Hartney, and welcome to my capstone lecture for the Violin Pedagogy program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I'm super excited to share with you some things today about pedagogy and then about one specific piece, and that would be Bach's G minor fugue. If you notice, I do have some fancy new toys here on the screen, so I'm going to try to keep up and make sure that everything goes smoothly. So here we go. The first thing I want to do is just give you an overview of what I have learned pedagogy to be, and that's just what I think it is. So the definition that I'm working with is the art and science of teaching. And going along with that are these four things. I think you need to have a deep knowledge of the subject that you're trying to teach. In this case, that would be violin performance. So things like taking lessons and all the coursework that I've done in music theory and music history, all of those things go together to build that base knowledge in the subject area. The second thing I think is important is a well-defined teaching philosophy, something that can guide you as you are working with students and deciding on a path for them. Of course, pedagogical knowledge, which is specific to how to teach violin, not necessarily the act of playing violin, but how to teach. And then finally is fluency. And that comes down to being able to access all of the information you have in those other spaces when it's appropriate and in a way that allows you to connect with students in the most efficient way possible. So my teaching philosophy comes from these three people mostly. Now, there are others, of course, that say these things too, but Maria Montessori, Shinichi Suzuki, and Robert Marzano are the three that I've chosen to focus on here. And what I've gotten from their teaching is that all children are always learning. And what that means is it's important for a teacher to construct positive environments, places where students feel free, comfortable, and are able to learn. Teachers need to craft desirable experiences. And this is something that teachers of any subject area will probably be used to the most. This is things like lesson planning and designing curriculum and things like that. I think it's important to place trust in students' ability. Suzuki did this a lot in his work, and it comes through in his writing. He really did believe that students had an innate ability to do something, anything, and you just had to nurture that in order to get students to achieve. And then finally, promoting learning, which is the lifelong drive that teachers hope their students have to learn new things all the time. The other thing that I'd like to mention is artistry in teaching. And this goes back to that idea that I just spoke about fluency. You do have to have a solid foundation of subject knowledge, but then also you can't really achieve artistry in teaching, that on the go kind of mentality where you get to innovate in the moment. That is what comes from fluency, or being able to access that information at any given moment. Moving on to this next section, which is called technical studies. And in this section, I do want to talk about the pedagogical knowledge that's required for teaching violin performance. And so in this area, I have three things. I have scales, etudes, and then oral preparation. So for scales, this is part of the basic training for string students, and making sure that students have an appropriate sequence starting from the very young ages all the way through the advanced levels. So starting at the beginning, students, even if when they're just starting, they're just learning parts of a scale. Maybe they're just playing, they're just using each finger on each string, right? And then moving through to an entire scale, maybe an A major scale if they're starting at the very beginning Suzuki levels. And then the end goal would be for them to start a scale study program like the Carl Fresh program, where you're working on 3-octave scales, you're working on arpeggios, you're working on octaves, you're working on thirds, sixths, tenths, all of those things, and you're doing it in all of the keys, minor and major. Along with that comes the fact that you need to establish practice techniques with your students. So letting them experience scales from the start is super important, because it allows them to make that a part of their daily ritual, a part of their daily routine, and something that they really can kind of start their practice sessions with. The second thing I want to talk about is etudes. And I think it's important to have a robust curriculum etudes, things that are very diverse, that allow students to work on very varied techniques that work both the left hand, the right hand, coordination, and all of those things. A scaffolded approach, I think, is important so that students are not working on things that are too advanced, and that also each activity that they engage in is pushing them forward and getting them to acquire new skills. And then finally, a balanced skill study is important. So you need something that addresses both the left hand and the right hand. And then also the coordination between the two is important. So I do here have a sample etude sequence, and I'm not going to go through it like line by line, but if you would like to take a closer look at it, just go on ahead and pause the video. But otherwise, let's plow forward. The last thing on this slide is oral preparation, and I think it's super important for students to listen to all sorts of things, but specifically giving assignments to students can do two things, even from the very, very first lessons, and that is allowing them to listen to things that they are currently working on and things that will benefit them in their current place is very helpful. So listening to repertoire that they're playing, that they're about to play, has its obvious benefits. But I also think that inspirational listening is important too. So pushing students to think about what's possible and kind of get that kind of spark of imagination from hearing something cool or something that they can't yet do, something that they hadn't comprehended was possible before, I think is important too. All right, and then the last thing that I want to talk about in this overview is the repertoire sequence. So I do have a sample sequence here, and I'll put it up briefly. And then once again, if you want to take a closer look at it, please go ahead and pause the video. But these are the things that I think are important to note when choosing a repertoire sequence. The sequence really should prioritize learning and growth. So you want students to be able to move through a sequence in a way that pushes them forward and that allows them to acquire new skills along the way. It should consider their current ability, so as to not give them things that are outside their reach or things that they would not have success performing without a little bit of work. And like I said, it should be something that promotes learning and growth. So you want to consider those desired next steps. What skills does a student need to acquire next? What would you like them to be able to do now that they have acquired their current set of skills? And all of that must be done in an individualized way. So that's, again, going back to the principles from Suzuki, that you really should consider the child that you're working with, or the student, the young adult, and think about what they need specifically. And it's okay to skip things. It's okay to go back to things if you have a set list. It's all right to replace things or even try new things. And that's this idea of being flexible. All right, so that is my overview of pedagogy, and I would like to now move into a specific piece, and that would be Bach's G minor fugue. So the sonata in G minor has the second movement is a fugue. And on this slide here is just a few of the challenges that come along with this piece. And this is just a brief slide. We will get into all of it shortly. But the challenges at a glance, I've broken it down into two pieces, and that is interpretation. So the musical interpretation of the piece and what challenges come from that, and also the actual physical movements that you have to do while you're playing the violin in order to create those things. So interpretation, the harmonic complexity of the piece, I think for students they could be unfamiliar with how Bach is able to put so much harmonic structure inside his pieces, especially this piece, and it can be surprising and also pretty wonderful and rewarding when you can get it right. Understanding the fugue form is very important, knowing what the parts are, how they function together, and what that means as far as interpretation. And then the fact that this fugue is scored for one instrument presents a lot of challenges in performance. So we'll talk about that too. In the physical movement section, I really think that the biggest challenges here come from the agility and precision that's required from both the left and the right hand. There's a lot of challenges intonation-wise, there's a lot of challenges bowing-wise, and coordinating all of those things together is a monster undertaking. And we can talk about the specific things that requires right now. All right, so technical challenges. I have picked 3 things to talk about in detail. Left hand agility, the way that chords are sounded, and then creating a melodic integrity throughout the piece. With these technical challenges, I want to talk about 3. I'm going to go kind of the same way through each of them. The 3 things I'm going to talk about are the pedagogical concerns with that particular thing, technical studies. These are etudes and exercises you can do to help overcome those obstacles. And then finally, things that you should remember as you're practicing, I guess you could think of it as things that I would make sure to tell a student to think about as they're practicing the things that I would assign in the technical studies section. All right, left hand agility and precision in double and triple stops. There are some examples on this slide, and I do apologize, you can't see me right now. I am still here, so I might toggle back and forth between myself and the slide, but we'll see. Pedagogical concerns. So there are new and unusual finger patterns that might come up as students are working on this. There's if you just look at this first example, and I have placed an arrow around one of the chords there, you'll see that it is it starts, there's an A, an F sharp, and a C. So the fingers are actually in half steps. Maybe this would be a good time for you to see me. The fingers are in half steps, right? But, maybe I do it this way. But the second and third fingers are actually crossed over each other. And so that can be a little tricky, that configuration can be a little tricky for a student. Having a pattern where 2 fingers are crossed over each other onto different strings is unusual, can be unusual. And in this case, it's complicated even more because it happens inside a larger, it happens in context, right? So if you look at the same example where the chord before it is also using the same 3 fingers, yet they are not crossed over. So not only are fingers changing position laterally across the string, but they're also moving from string to string. So there's really a 2-dimensional aspect to what the fingers are doing, and coordinating that lateral and horizontal motion of multiple fingers is very, very challenging. The second example highlights something else, which is that even though the fingers are moving horizontally and laterally, the motion could also involve a shift. So in the second example, you'll see this one is a small shift from first position to half position, but then fingers are crossing over, and it can be overwhelming if not approached in the correct way. The final example on this page is from measure 80, and it shows, once again, I've highlighted 2 chords that have finger patterns that are unusual, but also I did highlight the motion of the second finger. So if you look at the red circles, you'll see how the second finger is actually playing a different note in a different place on the instrument for each of those chords, and that's really a really tricky thing, and it happens a lot in this piece. So what do we do about it? Well, here are some technical studies that I would suggest. I do want to mention the Kreutzer etudes, numbers 32 through 42, and that's the numbering from the current edition that's in print. They all deal with double stops, but especially number 39, and I think I can get it to blow up. This is number 39. What I really, really like about this is that it does allow students to experience that idea of lateral and horizontal motion, moving across strings and moving positions, and also shifting, but it does that with only double stops. Instead of adding the complexity of 3 fingers, you can kind of focus on only 2, and I think it makes it just a little bit easier and kind of like a stepping stone to what happens to be the challenging stuff in the Bach fugue. We will come back to that one because there's some other good stuff in there too, so I will talk about it again later. The next one I have is Fiorello's Caprice number 4. And similar to the Kreutzer, this one is only in 2 voices, but I think it's just a little bit more intricate, and I think it has that same idea of allowing students to access this skill set at an easier level before trying it out with more than 2 fingers. I also have listed here an etude from Jones, and this is Opus 35, number 4. And this one does introduce a 3rd finger, and this one can be used, well, I'll show you later how we can use it for other things, but in this case, just working on that finger dexterity, this one shows how chords, three-note chords are produced in different finger patterns, and then they're shifting between each of them. So as students are working through this, they can get used to playing a chord with 3 fingers in a certain position, shifting to a new position that has a new finger pattern, and then sounding the chord in the new position. And that goes on through the entire exercise. So as students are working on these exercises, these are the things that I would make sure to tell them. That is to identify the finger pattern that you're looking at, and then also to look before and after those finger patterns to see what has changed. You can track the motion of each finger individually to make sure that things are moving smoothly. You can make sure that if you have to, a finger has to switch strings, does it go straight across the string? Does it have to move a half step in one direction or the other? You can check to make sure that the spacing between the fingers is correct. Maybe the spacing changes, but there's one finger that kind of anchors the motion. Look for things like that. And then also making sure to pick one finger to use as an anchor for shifting. So if you're shifting from one position to another, make sure that at least one finger is kind of staying on the string and leading the way through that shift. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is how chords are sounded in this piece. So 3 and 4-note chords are all over the fugue, but they are not all produced the same way. So the 3 techniques are producing them in a block, which is when all of the notes sound almost simultaneously. Broken, which is kind of the more traditional way students would probably be used to making chords in this way, where the lower notes are sounded first and then the chord is broken so that the upper notes sound after. And then finally a rolled chord, which is where the notes sound individually, and there's not really 2 or 3 notes that kind of sound at the same time. It's more of a quick flourish through all of them. Another thing that's interesting here, and this is the first time I encountered it, and that is sounding chords upside down. So chords on the violin usually happen from the bottom note to the top, and that's the standard practice. But in some instances, they need to be sounded upside down. So the upper note starts first, and then the bottom note is last. So I do have 3 examples here, measures 1 through 3. We will probably come back to this in a little while to talk about the opening of this piece and the fugal subject. But for now, I just want you to look at the last measure in there, where it kind of shows how the 3-note chords are there, and the fugue subject is in the topmost voice. So these chords being sounded in the traditional way would make sense, because the last note in a chord is the one that can sound the longest. So in this case, these would be a regular standard practice or bottom to top chord. And in the fugue subject, and I can talk about this in a little bit, reasons why, but I have been producing these chords in a block fashion. The second example, measure 30, is from one of the episodes, and this is where I think a rolled chord is more appropriate. It kind of helps differentiate things, but you can see how there's a melodic line in the upper voice, and then a rolled chord accompanying that is different from the block chord in the fugue subject. And then the final example shows how when the subject is in the lower voice, it would be appropriate to sound the chords upside down, or starting from the top note and going downwards. So how would I ask students to work on this? Well, I would actually have them do open string practice on sounding these chords first, practicing all three types of chords using open strings, making sure to include upside down chords using both directions of the bow, and then also in like the upper half, the lower half, full bows, that kind of thing, just to make sure it is well defined, so you can get like all of the areas, you can cover everything. So here I am again. And so if you're doing these open strings, the traditional way of doing a broken chord is to start with the lower strings and then break the chord so the upper strings are heard. For the block chord, you kind of want, instead of a motion that's like this, you kind of want it to be just an open and closed motion. Your arm is very flat and you want to hit all the strings almost simultaneously. So this would be the block chord. And then finally, the rolled chord, which you'll hear more of each of the notes individually, and that motion is kind of led more from your arm. So I would have students practice that going in both directions. And then the block chords also in both directions. Some more technical studies that could be useful, again from Kreutzer, I do have number 7 listed. And this helps with the agility from the right arm. These are just octaves, but what happens with these string crossings is hopefully from the shoulder joint, it helps to promote some movement in this area. As students are practicing the string crossing, this you can gain some flexibility in making sure that there's looseness in here and that the muscles are not tense as that's happening. Let's see, what's the next one? I did bring up again, I told you I'd bring it back, Don't Opus 35, number 4. And you can see now after practicing these for left hand intonation and agility, this could also be a useful exercise for the right hand and the bow arm, because these chords can be done either as block chords or as rolled chords, and students can practice doing both of those with this exercise. I do have another one from Opus 35, and this is number 9. And this one is kind of similar in the sense that it can be done with block chords or rolled chords. But if you'll notice, there are some that appear in the lower voice. So this one could actually be done with upside down. You could throw some upside down chords in here if you wanted to as well. All right, to make sure that students are successful as they practice these things, I would make sure to remind them that the focus is agility in the right arm. They should alter the speed of the notes during open string practice so that they can simulate different note values. So think about doing this with half notes, think about doing it with quarter notes, think about doing it with eighth notes, think about doing it with quarter notes with rests in between, or with eighth notes with rests in between, just to make sure that there is a structure behind each time you do it, making sure that it is not absent of rhythm, but rhythm can actually help drive the activity and the exercise. Paying attention to the arm level and to the fact that pivoting from your shoulder, here, let me see, maybe you can see me again. There we go. Pivoting from the shoulder is a different motion than opening and closing your arm. So making sure that both of those motions are active at the appropriate time. And then also using just the upper half or just the lower half of the bow to force a more precise motion. All right, we've made it through 2, and we are headed to the final one. And this one I think is pretty cool. So Here we go with melodic integrity. I'm sorry for this slide. There's a lot on here. I promise it won't take too long to get through. So the pedagogical concerns that come from this are threefold. First, the fugue subject has to be handled with fidelity. So if you want to create a continuity throughout the work. So every time the subject comes back, each statement of the subject must be alike. And it doesn't matter if it's a solo statement of the theme or if it is one or two additional voices that accompany it. The articulation must remain constant, even as new voices come in and even as the theme moves through different registers. The physical requirements, well, actually, let's wait for a second. Let's stop and let's just play a little bit. So the fugue begins, and this is the first three measures are have the fugue happening in three separate ways. So it starts in a middle voice, then it moves to a lower voice, and it finishes in the upper voice. So making sure that all of those things happen and that each one sounds the same, even if you add a second line. So beginning the first one, when it moves, now we add a second voice. And we finally add the third voice. Making sure that the articulation stays the same is what I mean by melodic continuity. So that should happen every time the theme is stated. You should get that same sense of what the theme is. Number two, the physical requirements of playing multi-note beats are very misleading sometimes. And one of the things I like to say about this is even if you just look at the way the notes are printed on the page, here, I'll blow this up so you can see. If you just look at the way the chords are, you kind of see this vertical structure, and that is completely contrary to the feeling you want to create as you're going through the fugue subject. So here's that fugue subject again, but you notice it's completely it's completed by all of these other voices with it. So you still have to have a horizontal motion as you're moving through the line, but the vertical structure kind of it can make students feel like things are not pushing forward, but they are segmented in a vertical way. And we want the horizontal motion to be portrayed. And then finally, just as I talked about before, the chords are not all created the same way. And the melodic integrity is kind of what's guiding the thinking behind that. So using the block chords during the fugal subject, like I just played in measure 3, it comes back in measure 20, and then through and throughout the piece. Rolled chords during the episodes. I don't think I played that for you. Maybe I can play that for you right now. So in the here we are. So you notice the chords are rolled there instead of block chords like they are in the subject. So the episodes have those rolled chords. And then finally, breaking the chords so you can emphasize cadences is something else that you can do. All right, so how do we work on this? Again, Kreutzer 39, I'll mention it because it has the simultaneously occurring independent lines, so you can work on making sure that melodic content is driving forwards instead of focusing on the vertical harmonic structure. And then I love these Telemen fantasies. They require performance of 2 or 3 simultaneously occurring independent lines, but they also have opportunities to practice broken and rolled chords. So I have 2 examples here. All right, so let's look at the first example, number 1 in B flat. And you'll notice that we do have melodic lines that are accompanied by either a single note or by double stop. So you get this double stop or triple stop event happening in this piece. What I like about these is I think students will really, really like performing these. It's a very small introduction, a very nice way to kind of introduce this idea of accompaniment notes going along with the melody, and it kind of fits inside these other cool little 16 note figures that I think students would really appreciate. The second one is more of the same. I think it's a little bit more intricate. But the same ideas apply, and I think students will appreciate being able to try their new skills inside a piece that's like the fugue, but not quite as demanding technically. All right, moving on. Practice techniques. Once again, these are the things I want to make sure to tell students as they're working through the activities that I would give them. First, identify and practice the fugal themes in isolation. Now, I did that before when I was explaining the first three measures. I played the melody and the theme first, each of them, the middle voice, the lower voice, and the upper voice. And then I started adding in the other lines to make sure that the theme had that integrity and that every time it came in, it was it had the same articulation and the same phrasing. All right, creating a separate character for the high, the middle, and the low statements of the theme. I think maybe you heard me do that too. I can show you once again. Let me just grab my violin. So the way I accomplished that was to make sure that I started the theme in the upper half of the bow. This was the first subject. Moving to the middle for the second statement. And then near the frog for the last statement. All right, and then adding accompanying lines carefully so they don't interfere with the established statement of the themes. Making sure to use those block chords and to make sure that if the chord needs to be sounded upside down, that's something that happens as well. Being aware that the episodes come in three varieties. There are variolage passages, the 16th note passages, and then also melodic lines mixed with chords. So once again, students have practiced that skill, especially with the don't etude, and they should be able to handle the lines that are in the episodes where the chords are rolled. And that's to differentiate them from the block chords of the fugue statement. Making sure that the sound of the up bow and the down bow do not differ. And then I would actually also encourage students to do some listening or some studying of scores. I would have them look, of course, at Bach organ fugues, just so they can see what a fugue looks like and what it sounds like in another context. Beethoven has 6 fugues for quartet. And then also, this is a fun one, I would have them listen to Handel's Messiah, the Hallelujah chorus. And I think it's like halfway through where there's a fugue in there. And it's kind of fun, and it's something that maybe they're familiar with, but it's another way to remind them of the form itself. All right, so we've made it through the technical challenges section, and I just have a couple more things to talk about. The first is thematic continuity, and then we'll get to the conclusion. So, yes. So where does this fit into the larger scheme of things for the student repertoire-wise? So the main concerns here are that a student needs to have a certain maturity in sound production before they can tackle a piece like the Bach fugue. The color changes, the different characters that need to be created require that. There needs to be readiness for the technical challenges, and I put an asterisk here because that's all of the stuff that I just talked about. Students need to be ready to take on those challenges. Understanding of Baroque phrasing is important, so making sure that they've done some other Bach or things like that could help with that. And then ability to create differentiated characters within a work. Again, that goes along with the maturity in sound production, but it goes beyond it, really into being able to find different ways to create a character that can come across in this piece, because it happens so quickly and so frequently throughout. So I do have some examples here. The first is the Bach Concerto in A minor, and they get exposed to Baroque phrasing and a structure that moves between two things. So like the tutti and solo sections are kind of analogous to the subject and the episodes in the fugue, where one interrupts something else, what's going on. They would get experience playing something by Bach, and then the second movement, the slow movement, actually, it's a good opportunity for them to practice that mature sound production that we're looking for, the good tone, and the best practices for bow distribution. All right. Banjo and fiddle. This was one of my favorites. I never actually played the whole thing when I was growing up, but there is some work with chords and left hand agility, moving quickly between different double and triple stop patterns, which is something that we talked about already in the technical challenges section. So I think that piece is a lot of fun, and students would enjoy playing it. Other solo Bach. This is not the easiest of the Bach solos for violin, so I would actually have them play maybe the E major partita or the D minor partita, parts of them, before tackling this work. So they would get experience playing solo violin by Bach. They could work on the phrasing, the 16th note passages that come in the fugue. Those are things that happen in both the E major and the D minor partita. And then, of course, melodic content embedded in double stops is a feature of all of the Bach solo works. So getting to see those in other contexts before seeing them in the fugue would be helpful. What else we have here? I mentioned these before, and I really, really, really do like these, the Telemen fantasies. Practice playing those melodic lines supported by double and triple stops. And then there are double stop passages with two independent lines. And there are some of those Telemen fantasies that are more difficult than the ones that I brought up. So I wouldn't necessarily have students work on all of them. They might be a fun respite if the Bach fugue work is getting a little bit too intense. I do have a full list here. Once again, I'm not going to go line by line through this, but if you'd like to look at this list, go on ahead and pause the video. All right, that is about it. I will just tell you that I found this quote by Robert Mazzano that I'd like to share. The art part of teaching is founded on the dual realizations that research cannot provide answers for every student in every situation, and that the same behaviors can be employed in a different order and fashion by two different teachers with equally beneficial results. And I think it's just a reminder that teachers have to have a toolbox, a tool set, things that they can pull up when the need arises. Some activities, exercises, etudes, or random pieces, things that they can use when students are facing a challenge that can help them through that. And that, to me, is what artistry in education is. And I have this printed on the slide for you too. Artistry in education, it means that teachers must not just have a solid foundation of knowledge in the subject they teach, but a fluency that allows them to innovate in the moment. Once again, being able to access all of those things when it's appropriate and when it's necessary for the students. So that's the journey I'm on. That's the journey I hope a lot of other teachers are on. I would like to say thank you so much for coming to my recital. And I really hope you enjoyed listening to my presentation, and I am excited to take your questions. Thank you again. Bye-bye.